Welcome to Cranmer Readings on the 16th of October, 2022. We're with Jasper Ridley's Thomas Cranmer in 1547. After Henry's death, Cranmer gets 12 homilies going, 3 of which are believed to be by Cranmer himself. Homily on salvation, homily on true and lively faith, and homily of good works. And rather errantly, Cranmer pulls Gardiner into the orbit, perhaps hoping he could conciliate the proud prelate and satisfy his cravings for ambition. Cranmer and Gardiner get into a tunnel. Gardiner rightly faults Cranmer for submitting to the King's Book of 1543, which contradicts the homily on salvation. Cranmer seeks to absolve himself by claiming that he disagreed with Henry in private, but submitted publicly to the king. It's ironic, the thick black smoke of irony of Gardiner playing the honesty cards is a moment of great hypocrisy. We turn our attention again to Edward VI and the homilies in this chapter. The homily of good works shows that Cranmer in the summer of 1547 was already in favor of abolishing holy bread and holy water and ceremonies of Palm Sunday and candles at Candlemas. But the injunctions of the visitors were issued for the royal visitation in May 1547 did not suppress these abuses. The visitors were ordered to remove any images to which pilgrimages or offerings were made, but images were not suppressed, and the doctrine laid down that images were only to be a representation and not an object of worship. It did not go beyond the doctrines of the King's Book. The provisions concerning the English litany and English primer were only an extension of the policy of 1544 and 1545, though it was not only laudable to work on holy days, but sinful to not work. No more holy days were suppressed. The only innovation was the reversal of the policy of 1543 by order requiring clergy to read the New Testament and Erasmus's paraphrase on it. Prescribing that a chapter from the English Bible was to be read at matins and evensong every Sunday and holy day. But there was nothing in the injunctions to encourage Protestant extremists. The people were forbidden to remove images or insult priests, to make any alteration in the fasting days or in any part of the common prayer, or to break the established ceremonies until the king abolished them. In September, this would be 1547, the council actually told Paulette, the great master, to replace images which had been improperly removed by the people, though the order was later countermanded. We know from Maurice that Cranmer was not entirely satisfied with the injunctions. It was this connection that he told Maurice that council would have preferred to have gone further. But now that they had an infant king instead of Henry, they feared to arouse opposition. Cranmer was probably referring to the failure to condemn holy water and holy bread and the ceremonies which he had criticized in his homily of good works. But if the injunctions did not go very far, they went far enough, along with the homilies, to arouse the resistance of Gardiner and Bonner. When the visitors arrived at St. Paul's, Bonner protested against the injunctions and declared that he accepted them insofar as they were lawful, and Gardiner resisted the visitation, though in a more surreptitious manner than Bonner. The council committed Bonner and Gardiner to the Fleet, but Bonner was released after a few days in view of his submission. Somerset with the army in Scotland when Bonner and Gardiner were imprisoned, and it has been suggested that Cranmer was responsible for the decision. There's no record of the attendance at the council meetings of the 12th and 25th of September at which Bonner and Gardiner were sent to the Fleet. The minutes of both meetings were signed by Somerset, Cranmer, Paulet, Northampton, Brown, Wingfield, and North, but this is no proof of the presence of these councillors, for the minutes were often signed a long time later, and Somerset was in fact absent on both occasions. But Cranmer was probably present, for he had been attending nearly every meeting of the council since Henry's death, and the emperor's ambassador reported that Cranmer was one of the chief members of the council to whom the government of the country had been delegated during Somerset's absence. It's also probable that Cranmer was in favor of committing Bonner and Gardiner to prison, for this was a quarrel which touched the prince. Cranmer had no wish to revenge himself on Gardiner for his plots, or to punish the two bishops for the blood of the Protestant martyrs which they had spilt at Henry's orders. But their refusal to submit now, as he himself had submitted in the year, was for Cranmer a serious offense, and to argue that an infant king and his protector needed not to be obeyed was nothing less than sedition. Cranmer treated Gardiner as he would have treated any other man who disobeyed royal authority. On 7 October 1547, although Gardiner had been nearly a fortnight in the Fleet, he was brought before Cranmer, who sat with Ridley, the new bishop of Rochester, and Cox, the king's almoner, and others to hear the case. Cranmer argued with Cranmer about the homily of salvation in a conciliatory and even defensive manner, but told him that the whole realm had accepted the homilies and that he alone was obdurate. He then told Gardiner that if he would submit, he would be reinstated to the king's council to work together with his old colleagues under the Protector, but that if he were defiant, he would be sent back to the Fleet. Gardiner indignantly rejected the proposal, and in his account of the interview, which is the only account we have, he interpreted it as an attempt to bribe him. But Cranmer had done nothing improper or unusual in offering Gardiner the opportunity of purging his contempt by submission, and thereafter rendered further services to the king to the best of his abilities. The only novelty was Gardiner's attitude. The author of De Vera Obedientia, the great executive of King's despotism, announced that neither offers of advancement nor orders of the government would induce him to betray his faith. Though Gardiner drew a distinction between an adult king and protector, he had in effect been driven to the victory of heresy to reject the royal supremacy and set up against the king's authority the orthodoxy of an authoritarian church. Thus ends that chapter. As we shift to chapter 18 in the Book of Common Prayer. The Parliament and Convocation of November 1547 marked the first real attempt to overthrow the Orthodox religion and transform England into a Protestant state. Under the pressure of events, Cranmer had advanced a considerable distance since the summer, when he adopted the attitude that with an infant king, it was necessary to move more slowly, than if Henry were still alive. By November, he was prepared under Somerset's leadership to take a step which Henry had always opposed, and to abolish the three abuses which were featured in the discussions with the German Lutherans in 1538: the denial of the cup to the laity, private masses, and the celibacy of the clergy. When convocation met on November 5, 1547, Cranmer promptly obtained a license from the king, pardoning the members of convocation from any offense which they might commit under the Act of 6 Articles, by expressing their opinion on the three abuses. And the clergy, thus reassured, proceeded to pass a resolution in favor of permitting the marriage of priests, and another which approved of the administration of the communion to the laity in both kinds. The latter resolution did not deny that both body and blood are present in both the bread and wine, but it urged the adoption of a practice, though strictly speaking not heretical, had been considered as heretical by implication. Somerset and Cranmer were moving slowly forward. They introduced a bill to permit the marriage of priests so late in the session that there was no time to pass it into law, but there was no delay in proceeding with a bill permitting the sacrament of the altar to be administered to the laity in both kinds. The situation had been so transformed by the death of the autocrat whom Cranmer had served for so long, and by the liberal spirit in the air. Cranmer was now prepared to support measures that he knew Henry had condemned, and in a parliament which abolished all the statutes for the burning of heretics and greatly reduced the terror of the treason laws. He found courage to vote against the official policy of Somerset's government when he joined the conservative bishops in the House of Lords in opposing the Second Chantries Bill, which completed the seizure of chantries which Henry had begun in 1545. We do not know the grounds of Cranmer's opposition to the seizure of the chantries in 1547, but 5 years later he was arguing that the sale of the chantries should be postponed in order that the assets should be available for Henry Edward's use when he came of age. Primarily his real motive, both in 1547 and 1552, was the same that led him to oppose the distribution of monastic lands. For though he condemned chantries as much as monasteries, he objected in both cases to the suppression of these obnoxious institutions being made the excuse for the enrichment of courtiers. He had not, of course, voted openly in Parliament against the seizures of the monasteries, and he would no more have voted against the Second Chantries Act if Henry had been alive than he would the Orthodox bishops who supported him in his opposition and who set him the example of parliamentary independence by voting against a bill for the administration of sacraments in both kinds. Maurice states that Cranmer argued for the staying of the chantries until His Highness had come of full age, against the Duke of Northumberland. He was therefore not referring to the occasion of the Chantries Act of 1547, before Northumberland had come to power, but obviously to the time when the commission of the sale of the chantries was set up in July 1552. No action was taken in Parliament or Convocation with regard to private masses, but Cranmer dealt with this immediately after the session ended at Christmas, when he formulated some questions to be answered by himself and other bishops and divines as to whether the sacrament of the altar benefited any other than communicants. and as to the origin and desirability of the practice by which the priest alone communicated. Other questions dealt with the masses for souls and the language in which the mass should be celebrated. On the question of private masses, Cranmer and John Taylor adopted as unequivocally the Lutheran position, which was in advance of all their colleagues, for neither Ridley, Barlow, Cox, Goodrich, nor Holbeach were prepared to join Cranmer in stating without qualification. The receiving of the said sacrament by one man doth avail and profit only him that receiveth the same. The other reformers agreed with him that it was desirable to revert to the practice of the primitive church, whereby the people received the Mass sacrament with the priest, and that the Masses for the dead should be abolished. The question of language, Cranmer said, I think it convenient to use the vulgar tongue in the Mass, except in certain mysteries whereof I doubt, a position in which the other reformers were more or less concurred. The Orthodox bishops objected to the Mass being said in English, and asserted that though it was always better if there were other communicants, it was not unlawful for the priest to celebrate Mass alone. The sharpest division of opinion came in reply to the question, what is the oblation and sacrifice of Christ in the Mass? Christ answered, the oblation and sacrifice of Christ in the Mass is not so called because Christ indeed is there offered and sacrificed by the priests and the people, for that was done but once by himself on the cross. But it is so called because it is a memory and representation of the very true sacrifice and immolation which before was made upon the cross. His position was clearly adopted by Holbeach, Goodrich, Barlow, and Taylor, and a little more ambiguously by Ridley and Cox. The Orthodox bishops took the traditional attitude that the Mass was, in fact, a sacrifice. In November and December 1547, the Protector took action against the extremists. He was conscious that the extremists were a menace to authority, and he feared the Emperor, who warned the English government not to proceed further with the Reformation, and had obtained assurance from Somerset that he had no intention of doing so. A royal proclamation was issued to punish any apprentice manhandled or insulted a priest, and an act of Parliament made any insult to the sacrament of the altar an offense punishable by imprisonment at the king's pleasure. On the 27th of December 1547, a royal proclamation, of which Cranmer must have approved, even if he did not draft it, prohibited all discussion about the nature of the presence except by learned men in private. The people must believe that the body and blood of Christ is there, but no one must discuss in pulpit or alehouse whether it is there really or figuratively, whether with legs, arms, toes, and nails, or whether both flesh and blood were in both the bread and wine. This was the old policy of Henry's reign of imposing complete prohibition on criticism and defense of established doctrines. During the first half of 1548, Somerset and Cranmer were moving slowly forward, but they were determined to prevent the Reformation from developing too fast. January 1548, candles at Candlemas, ashes on Ash Wednesday, and palms on Palm Sunday were suppressed. And the 21st of January, the council ordered Cranmer to remove all remaining images. Before the end of the year, all ceremonies had been abolished except the sepulchre at Easter and 2 lights before the high altar and in the leading places of worship like the Chapel Royal and St. Paul's. More and more the service was being conducted in English. But fasting in Lent and on fast days was enforced. The proclamation of the 6th of February, which announced that no one would be punished for failing to creep to the cross on Good Friday or refusing to use holy water or holy bread, threatened to punish with imprisonment anyone who did not use all other ceremonies which had not yet been suppressed. All unlicensed preaching was forbidden. Steps were taken to restrain the reformers who had been granted a preaching license. On 13 May, Somerset wrote to the preachers and told them that it is not the preacher's part to bring into contempt and hatred which the prince doth either allow or its content to suffer. Why should a private man or preacher take this royal and kingly office upon him, and not rather, as his duty is, obediently follow himself, teach likewise others to follow and observe what is commanded? It is part of the godly man not to think himself wiser than the king's majesty and council, but patiently to expect and conform himself. Cranmer was certainly in full agreement with these sentiments. We'll bring him, Jasper Ridley, to a close as we shift to Prof. MacCulloch. Give me a second here. And last time we were with Prof. MacCulloch, unfortunately, Cranmer was tied up with business at Hampton Court in 1542 and in early 1543. And as such, he was away from Kent and Canterbury as the militant traditionalists were squaring off with his evangelical staff. The militants were gaining confidence that Cranmer could be taken down. 1542 to 1546 thus becomes a period of survival on Cranmer's part in backroom tactics by his earnest enemies, and will develop into the famous story of the 1543 Prebendaries Plot. So we turn to Chapter 8, A Problem of Survival, 1542 to 1546. Traditionally, the attacks made on Cranmer in 1543 have been known as the Prebendaries Plot, but as has been clear after recent detailed investigations by Michael Zell and Glenn Redworth, that latter label obscures the reference of these events. One problem in understanding what happened is that some parts of the story are brilliantly illuminated by a welter of testimony which survives from Cranmer's personal papers. These are chiefly examinations of Kentish clergy involved in direct attack on Cranmer, and they are indeed so voluminous that they threaten the reader with archival indigestion. Other equally important parts are less well documented, and there are so many connections with other conservative initiatives at the same time that it's very difficult to sort out the dynamics of what was happening. What is clear is that not just the conservative clergy of Canterbury Cathedral were involved. Zell's treatment of the affair in 1975 highlighted the role of Kentish gentry. Redworth's biography of Stephen Gardiner in 1989 concentrated on the bishop's coordinating position, although Redworth was paradoxically concerned to discredit Gardiner's traditional evangelical stereotype as Wily Winchester, which in fact seems amply proved by Redworth's own meticulous analysis. Both these interpretations proved fruitful because so many strands of conservative opposition came together in 1543, although neither Zell nor Redworth exhausted the exposure of the conservative networks, as we shall see. All of these strands are interlinked, all played a part, and their complexity may well explain why the plot against Cranmer eventually failed. The essence of success would be speed, yet no one succeeded in coordinating the long drawn out and multifaceted initiative successfully, not even Gardiner, in contrast to the lightning success of the aristocratic coup. Um, Let me just shift here. I see someone has shown up. A student of Turretin, I believe. I have a quick question regarding the Lord's Day. Is watching professional sports on the Lord's Day permissible, or would it be a fourth commandment violation? I think it is. I think we are to confine our labors on the Lord's Day to reading and meditation, prayer, worship, and to avoid such things. That's my view. I come from a very strict Sabbatarian background by way of English Anglicanism, English Presbyterianism. So that's my view, to student of Turretin. But back to the 1543 coordination of events against Cranmer. Ultimately, Henry III was given time to change his mind and side with the Archbishop. To that extent, Redworth's minimizing of Gardiner's Machiavellianism as a point. The first traceable initiative in the whole business came at the end of 1542, a year full of trouble and contention in Kentish religious politics. One Sunday in Advent, Robert Serles rode to a Chilham church to preach for Dr. John Willoughby. To make the name Prebendaries Plot all the more inexact, neither cleric was actually a prebendary of the cathedral. Serles was one of the six preachers, and Willoughby, who'd only been in the diocese for 3 years, had no cathedral office, although he may have established links there because he was a medical doctor. While Serles was at Chilham, however, he talked about his traumatic experience of 1541 in trying to denounce Cranmer, and he tried to enlist Willoughby in a fresh proposal for articles of accusation against the Archbishop and his friends, which he and his company should devise. Willoughby showed cautious interest as long as they might be true and provable. One notes already that Serles had a recognizable company, and not surprisingly, they comprised his like-minded colleagues at the cathedral. Serles, for the moment, apparently left Willoughby as a sleeping partner of the plan, and instead he concentrated with Prebendary William Gardiner on gathering material against the diocesan evangelicals. This they continued doing through the winter 1542 and 43. Nearly all the later strands of 1543 actions are already involved in this Advent encounter. Serles was a former member of Merton College, Oxford, and he still held the living of St. Peter in the East within the Oxford city walls. He was also, despite this 1541 trauma and temporary expulsion, still on the staff of Canterbury Cathedral. Dr. Willoughby, Serles' host that Sunday, took a series of Oxford degrees rather late in life after his arrival in Kent, probably in addition to his medical degrees from elsewhere. He also had court links as a royal chaplain. originally, ironically, because he was the cousin and doctor of Anne Boleyn. But he showed himself no evangelical leanings. Quite the contrary. Willoughby had been appointed to Chilham in 1539 by two leading conservative gentry of Kent, Sir Anthony St. Ledger and Edward Thwaites, the pamphleteering publicist for Elizabeth Barton, the Maid of Kent. St. Ledger was otherwise engaged in the king's service throughout this affair, masterminding the even more complex business of converting Ireland from lordship to kingdom as Henry's Lord Deputy. Thwaites, however, was actually a student in Chilham, having saved his traditional skin from total disaster on Barton's fall by adroitly switching into Cromwell's service. It was probably his influence which led Willoughby to talk approvingly in his parish about Barton's now desolate cult centre of Our Lady at Court at Street, and also to preserve at Chilham the empty shrine of St. Augustine from St. Augustine's Abbey at Canterbury. Thwaites, moreover, was an old friend of at least two of the conservative Canterbury Prebendaries, Sir Anthony St. Ledger's brother Arthur, and Archbishop Warham's old secretary Richard Parkhurst, himself married the widow of Warham's nephew. Oxford, the shadow of Elizabeth Barton, the golden memory of Warham, ex-monks, conservative gentry, conservative courtiers. Perhaps the most important unifying factor of all these strands was the former Warham connection with Kent, and the fact that it was given a natural and enduring outlet to the wider world by strong links between the Warham-era clergy and the Oxford University. This was not just because Warham himself had been an Oxford don, but because of the ancient and intimate structural connection between the Archdiocese and Oxford. Partly this was through the Archbishop's role as the founder and visitor of All Souls College, with its many ecclesiastical lawyers who dominated the higher levels of Canterbury courts. However, an even more important link between Canterbury Cathedral Priory and Canterbury College, Oxford, a mixed community of monastic and lay scholars dependent on the cathedral. The college's monastic recruitment had, of course, been principally from the Canterbury itself. It was also drawn on other great Benedictine houses in the southeast, including Winchester Cathedral Priory. The web of relationships thus created had been torn apart by the college's dissolution in 1540. The bitterness of the dissolution must have been compounded by the fact of surviving evidence indicates that the college's flourishing expansion in the early 16th century. The primary conservative fellows and members of Canterbury College would have had their sense of waste and loss in the early 1540s, compounded by the consciousness of the alien clique, overwhelmingly Cambridge men, which surrounded the chief obvious villain of the closure, Archbishop Cranmer. Three former wardens of Canterbury College, all of course ex-monks, were still on the staff of the cathedral after its refoundation. Prebendaries William Hunt, alias Hadley, Richard Thorndon, and William Gardiner, alias Sandwich. The warden for the last 6 years before the surrender was Gardiner, alias Sandwich, whom we have met in 1541, urgently buttonholing Bishop Stephen Gardiner in Canterbury Cathedral. He was already emerging in winter 1543 as one of the chief agents of the Prebendaries Plot. One of the considerations in Prebendary Gardiner's mind in his machinations against Cranmer may have even been the restoration of Canterbury College to its former place in the university. Its final fate was not clear between 1540 and 1545, and the cathedral chapter was still carrying out repairs and alterations in the buildings. Meanwhile, dispossessed Canterbury dons cherished their friendships with former Oxford colleagues, and during visits to the university, they vented their angry feelings about the changed times. In early 1543, there was still one element to pull Canterbury and Oxford together and to add further ingredients and to stir up the whole poisonous brew working against the Cranmer set. This was to introduce Dr. John London as the would-be deus ex machina to the Kentish scheme. London was a flamboyant figure who makes an agreeably satisfying villain for Cranmer partisans in his 1543 troubles, a persecutor of Oxford evangelicals as early as 1528, and a papalist sympathizer in the 1530s, who nevertheless played an eager part in the dissolution of the monasteries and friaries. He eventually died in prison, accused of perjury, after the plot against Cranmer had collapsed. He was also a lifelong member of the Winchester-Oxford nexus, which had taken him from school days at Winchester College to the wardenship of Winchester's sister college, New College, Oxford. Robert Serles would have been a familiar figure to him, for Serles' Oxford parish of St. Peter peers over the college wall at New College. It's perhaps relevant that Archbishop Warham had followed precisely the same academic career as Dr. London in earlier years, but it was even of more immediate significance that the ex officio visitor of both Winchester College and New College was Bishop Stephen Gardiner. Through John London, Gardiner was drawn, probably not unwillingly, into the web of activity against Cranmer. Gardiner seems to have been that rare bird, Cambridge man, who came to prefer the other place. He took a very active interest in Winchester and New College after becoming Bishop of Winchester, where he became very much an absentee in his continuing role as Master of Trinity Hall, Cambridge, and notably an active Chancellor of Cambridge University during the 1540s. Perhaps the growing strength of evangelicalism in Cambridge disgusted him, in contrast with the relative evangelical weakness in Oxford. In an exercise in tracing Cranmer's and Gardiner's employees throughout their episcopal careers, I found, unsurprisingly, that Cranmer showed a clear preference for Cambridge over Oxford men, 44 to 23. A smaller scale exercise for Gardiner showed a much less dramatic contrast, 16 Cambridge men to 13 of Oxford, with among the Oxford men, more than half from Dr. London's New College. And we'll bring that to a close here. Glory be to the Father, to the Son, and to the Holy Ghost. Amen. Jeffrey Mwangi, following from Kenya, Africa. Very good to have you, Jeffrey. Also good to have the student of Turretin. Turretin is one of my favorites. Glory the Father, to the Son, and Holy Ghost.